now bring in Derek Chollet. Thank you for being with us. Derek is the counselor at the U.S. State Department, which is an undersecretary position at the Department of State. He previously had a number of positions in government, including as the Assistant Secretary for International Security Affairs at the Department of Defense, as a Senior Director for Strategic Planning at the NSC. He's been in a number of different think tanks, including GMF and CNAS back in the day, and also written a number of books, including most recently on, sort of the foreign policy of Barack Obama, Dwight Eisenhower, and George H.W. Bush, and some of the similarities there and the themes there. So, Derek, it's great to have you here. And I also got to say that we're excited to have a State Department official for this military-focused report, because one of the big ideas is, just because we reduce our military presence in the Middle East doesn't mean we reduce our engagement in the Middle East, right? And so that's kind of the point. It all has to work together. And for our audience, just before I get started, you can participate by asking questions today. There's a chat box in the cnas.org/live, where many of you guys might be watching this, or on Twitter using the hashtag CNAS 2021. And you can ask a question doing that, and we'll try to get to some of those as well. So Derek, let me start with you. Thanks for being here. And yeah, so and let me ask you, we are shifting to the Indo-Pacific. That is kind of the focus. But we also care about other things like the Middle East. And so how do you balance those two, and how do you think about that?
Sure. Well, thanks, Ilan. It's great to be with you and with CNAS. I spent 2 of the best years of my professional life at CNAS some time ago now, 14 years ago. But it's great to be back. And I really want to congratulate you and your colleagues as well on what I think is a terrific report. I'm not endorsing it on behalf of the U.S. government, but as a former and future think tanker, I very much admire the work, and I think it really accurately reflects our overall thinking, as well as a lot of the challenges we have before us. So just congratulations on what is a really good product, and I really commend everyone to read it. Look, as you said, we have a broader strategy that this administration has that really now goes back 3 administrations to try to reorient a lot of our effort diplomatically, economically, militarily towards the challenges of the future, which we see emanating from the Indo-Pacific. That's not to say that we do not have core national security interests elsewhere, and we still need to conduct policies and forge policies that are going to meet those other interests. And that's really the challenge, is that it's not an effort to try to downgrade certain things. It's an effort to try to calibrate what we're doing around the world across all of our elements of power to achieve our broader interests. And clearly, in the Middle East, the United States still has interests that are core to our security, our economic well-being, and we think for the improvement of the world overall. I mean, I think this report captures quite accurately, I think, as we see it, the interests and objectives that the Biden administration is trying to achieve in the report. I think it mirrors fairly closely, actually, in terms of laying out the interests and objectives, what was captured in the interim national security guidance that came out earlier this year in March, and that I think will be reflected in the coming months in the national security strategy when that is released. Obviously, the Middle East remains critically important to the United States for a variety of reasons, whether it's the strategic location, it's our whether it's access to markets and energy, whether it's sea lanes, of course, our ironclad support for Israel's security, our efforts to counter and deter Iranian aggression, obviously counterterrorism, which remains central, and particularly the fight against ISIL, as well as our broader interests in trying to improve the lives of people and enable people to seize opportunities. Really, for all of these reasons, the U.S. is going to remain engaged in the Middle East, deeply engaged, and economically, diplomatically, and militarily. in the area of responsibility that we have here at the State Department, the Biden administration's tried very hard over the last 10 months to remain as diplomatically engaged in the challenges and the opportunities of the Middle East as we can. Of course, like all of us, we were grounded for the first few months and unable to travel. But when we've been able to get back on airplanes again, we have been really consistently present in the Middle East diplomatically. I, along with Brett McGurk and former colleagues of ours, Ilan Dana Stroll, Joey Hood, we went out to the Gulf in May of this year to try to, as one of the first trips of a senior delegation to the Gulf, to really send the message that the U.S. Is committed to the region, is committed to remaining deeply engaged. And despite the fact that we have a full plate of challenges around the world, that what happens in the Middle East remains central in our minds. I think the question that we face, and the question that you try to tackle in this report, is what is the right level of military engagement that's going to be required to achieve those core interests and objectives. As the interim national security strategy that I mentioned just a bit ago makes very clear, the view of this administration is that military force is not the sole means by which the U.S. is going to be able to achieve its objectives. And given the challenges we face all around the world and the finite resources we have, our goal is to right size that military presence, do so in a way that we have enough capability in theater that we're able to protect our interests and achieve our overall aims, but at the same time we're not out of balance with where we have to our needs elsewhere. And so that's really the challenge that our Pentagon colleagues have in terms of figuring out what that right size looks like. There is a global posture review, as you know, underway, and so that's the core issue that they're going to be tackling. There is as we look at a global distribution of force, what makes the most sense given the changing threat picture and given our overall strategy. But here at the State Department, and I think this holds for the overall administration, if our military numbers may change a bit here and there, our diplomatic engagement, our political engagement, our economic engagement is, if anything, it's only intensifying. And I think we're intent to be more engaged in more places in more ways over the next 3 years than we have ever been before, even if perhaps the military postures adjusted slightly.
So Derek, I want to talk to you about like one of the diplomatic challenges that comes in all this. And you talked about your trip to the Gulf, which is, and we've seen this before, again, the Obama administration and the Trump administration felt some of the same things. When you start talking about shifting more focus on the Indo-Pacific, our friends in the Middle East see this, they hear this, and inevitably, like, there's some anxiety associated with that, right? It's natural, it's understandable. And so how do you as an official, and how are we thinking about, conveying to them, what kind of messages are you conveying to them that just because maybe our military presence isn't going to be what it has been, maybe it's been out of whack and we really do need to be rethinking some things about resources, but like, how do you show them you're still there and we still care and like the relationship is still there?
Yeah, it's a great question, Ilan. And I am reflecting back to my time in the Obama administration where we had many of the same conversations because, of course, then early on, the effort was to rebalance to the Indo-Pacific. And in many ways, that's been kind of an underlying theme of the past of President Obama, of course, the Trump administration, as well as the current administration. And it's an enduring challenge because, and I really experience it since I've got I look at all different parts of the world, not just the Middle East in my current job. And similarly, when I was at the Pentagon, I spent a lot of time in the Middle East, but had to also think a lot about Europe and elsewhere. That if you think of the three strategic arenas that matter the most to the United States in terms of our security commitments, economics and political alliance and politics, our alliances, the Middle East, Europe, and the Indo-Pacific, and all three of those strategic arenas We have core national security interests that are at stake. We have in two of those regions, in Europe and the Indo-Pacific, we have treaty alliances. In the Middle East, we don't have any treaty alliances, but we have partnerships that are as close to alliances as one can get in terms of formal legal commitments. And in all three regions, we have a large degree of uncertainty, of instability, and questions about the future. Rise of China, Russia's behavior, Iran's behavior, Russia and China in the Middle East. I mean, there's a lot of churn in the system. And in all of those regions, and I experience this every day here, and in many ways this has not changed over the last 10 years, there's a desire for more of the United States. More of our time, more of our energy, more of our attention, more of our force posture. And as we all know, more of everything is not a strategy. So what the challenge for those of us, for all of us, not just those of us in government, but those of us, folks at CNAS and elsewhere who think deeply about these issues, is how we rack and stack the various interests and goals we have, and how we match our resources, which are by definition finite. I mean, we are blessed in that we have fewer limitations than any other country in the world, and we can do more than any other country in the world, particularly militarily. But that doesn't mean that we live in a world without limits. We also have limits in what we can do. And the challenge we have is, how do we strike that right balance? Diplomatically, one way to solve it, and even in diplomacy there are limits, right? Secretary of State can only be in one place at a time. But the key is showing up. The key and showing up steadily, not just on one-offs, but remaining deeply engaged. It's, as I said, trying to not just overemphasize one instrument of our power, but to be more engaged in more places in more ways. I can say that at least in the first 10 months, that engagement has been very consistent and intense. And when it comes to senior level time, which is the most finite resource one has in government, there's still, I would say, an abundant. I don't want to say the majority, but there's still a lot of senior level time spent on the challenges of the Middle East. And we obviously have significant force posture that remains there, as your report points out. And I think the kind of baseline question we have to ask ourselves is, what is enough? And when we say that there should be perhaps more of a U.S. military presence in the Middle East, it's compared to what period in time? When is it that? Because, and again, we hear this often, and we all hear it not only in the Middle East, we hear it in Europe and Asia. We want more of the United States here, particularly militarily. We want more of your forces here. We want more permanent presence. We want more rotational presence. We want more ships. We want more planes. So when it comes to the Middle East, I always ask, well, what's the baseline? Is the baseline pre-9/11? Is the baseline immediately post 9/11? Is the baseline 150,000 troops in Iraq in 2007, 2008? Is it 2014? We've got roughly 40 to 50,000 forces stationed there. We have multiple bases there. That's important for the Middle East. It's also important for U.S. power projection broadly. We would not have been able to execute the withdrawal from Afghanistan as rapidly and efficiently as we did, in terms of getting 120,000 people out in 2 weeks, if we did not have critical partners and longstanding relationships and facilities in the Middle East to enable that effort. So that's the question: is what's enough? And particularly as capabilities change, it may not just be about presence, but the kinds of activities we are doing, the kinds of capabilities we're putting in the theater, that's going to make the biggest difference.
So, well, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, this is, as you say, this is the hardest challenge that we have as we try to balance amongst all these things across the world. I'm curious also, you've written, take us in a slightly different direction. You've written about, your latest book was really about Eisenhower, Bush, and Obama, and sort of how they shared this pragmatic, sort of centrist vision of U.S. foreign policy, but also one that was, pretty optimistic about the world and global leadership. Not your necessarily traditional realist perspective of the world, but I wonder like what they would say. I mean, you can always ask President Obama, but not Bush or Eisenhower, but how you'd apply that thinking, to this challenge specifically, but maybe also just more generally to how you're thinking about, foreign policy now that you've been, inside the department for a year almost in this job.
Well, look, a lot of the themes that Eisenhower, Bush 41, Obama struggled with, we are struggling with today in terms of how you try to execute a broader strategy, recognizing that we live in a world of limits, and how you achieve the balance among resources in terms of how you're applying yourself, whether it's diplomatically, militarily, economically, across this range of issues when they're competing demands. And it's interesting. I mean, if step back and think about it, each of the three presidents, Eisenhower, Bush 41, and Obama, approached the Middle East at a moment of major geopolitical change. Eisenhower approached the Middle East at a moment where the Cold War was calcifying, the Soviets were gaining steam, and we were seeing the end of the colonial era. Bush, of course, looked at the Middle East with the end of the Cold War and sort of the new opportunities, perhaps, that came from the end of the Cold War rivalry, where the Middle East was really seen just as part of the chessboard between the U.S. and the Soviet struggle. But that also saw some opportunity there in dealing with threats like Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. Obama came in probably in a less hopeful moment for the Middle East, but with a sense that there was a hangover from our invasion and occupation of Iraq, as well as the broader sense that we had been imbalanced in sort of the post 9/11 years in terms of where we had put our time and attention, overdoing it perhaps a bit in the Middle East at the expense of ignoring other things or not putting enough emphasis on other things elsewhere, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. And I really you can see a through line between these three presidents, even though, it's probably sometimes some folks may not, it'd be maybe odd to see them as a distinct cohort, but I really do. And you see a commonality in their approaches as well, whether it was their commitment to sustaining the U.S. position in the Middle East for the long term, right? Even if it meant perhaps reducing posture here and there militarily, ensuring that we have a set of policies that we can sustain over time, which is very critical that they were focused on. Maintaining the robust military presence, but doing so within limits and acknowledging perhaps that the U.S. has to operate within limits, which was controversial really, and all three presidents were criticized for talking openly about the limits of U.S. power, despite their confidence, despite their optimism about America's role in the world, despite their commitment for the U.S. to continue to be a leader. They spoke openly about the fact that the U.S. couldn't do everything and got criticized for being weak as a result. And they were all, and I think this is another area that animates the current approach. They were all committed to building coalitions and to trying to strengthen our partnerships, and saw that our interests could be served not just by what the United States does itself, but by the way the United States serves as a catalyst for others, by the way we can build up others' capacity and strengthen the networks that others have with one another to try to tackle problems collectively. And then all three presidents struggled. They struggled with, as I said, the acknowledgement of limits. They struggled with constant demands that the U.S. do more. All of them had a certain degree of humility, and they did not see restraint as a dirty word, and all were criticized at various points for exercising a degree of restraint, particularly in the Middle East. And in many ways, they all suffered politically for it. Look, I think there's a lot we don't want to overdo the comparison between the challenges that Ike faced in Suez and Bush in the Gulf War, and Obama with Iraq and Syria and the rise of ISIL to our current moment. But I think there are a lot of lessons learned that certainly I, for one, keep in the back of my mind every day.
Well, with that, thank you, Derek. That was really interesting, especially like, given taking an opportunity to pull you out of State Department stuff and into some of these other like bigger questions about sort of the history of U.S. foreign policy and how it applies to today, and your book. And thank you for taking this time with us. I think it's like this was like the perfect sort of scene setter that we needed to then be able to dive into nuts and bolts for our follow-on discussion, because you really can't have a discussion about where we're moving assets and what we might do and not do in the Middle East without like understanding this broader context. And so thank you. I think I'll let you go since I know your time is tight, and but really appreciate you taking the time, and hope we can have you back again. I'm sure CNAS will love to have you back for all kinds.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a great pleasure and honor to be back. And again, congratulations on what's a terrific report, and I'll look forward to catching up on the discussion later. But thanks everybody for joining us this morning. Appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you, Derek. And now what I'm going to do is bring in our panelists for the discussion. We have first Elisa Catalano-Ewers. Elisa is an adjunct senior fellow here at CNAS, one of the co-authors of this report. Elisa held multiple jobs through years in government, as the NSC director for the Middle East, as a Middle East advisor to the UN ambassador. We worked together on Iran issues for a number of years. When I was at the Pentagon, she was the State Department, and also, spent time working on the ground in Iraq. Next, we have Becca Wasser, who is a fellow with the defense program here at CNAS, and another one of our partners on this project. And Becca previously was at the RAND Corporation. She is an expert. I mean, I think she spends most of her time these days coming up with very interesting, crazy, wild war games that will blow your mind in terms of the scenarios that she's playing out. But she also is like, a secret Middle East expert, more than a secret Middle East expert, having spent a lot of time focusing on this part of the world. And finally, we have Mick Mulroy, who is the founder of the Lobo Institute, and also an NEI, a non-resident senior fellow at the Middle East Institute. And Mick, prior to this, was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Middle East during the early years of the Trump administration, under Secretary Mattis, and also has a long career in the CIA as a paramilitary operations officer, and especially given a lot of the issues that the challenges we still face in the Middle East in terms of have to do with counterterrorism, have to do with how you work with local partners. We just thought he'd be a great addition to this discussion. And also, given his experiences in the Trump administration, we thought would be really valuable for this panel. So just thank you all for being here. Elisa, I'm going to start with you, and folks can just a reminder to our audience, folks can keep asking questions, by using the chat box on our cnas.org/live, or on Twitter, using the hashtag CNAS 2021. And so we'll go through some questions with our panelists, and then we'll take questions from the audience as well. And we've already had a couple that came in for Derek Chollet that unfortunately I didn't get to get out there, but I think we can throw towards our panelists instead. So Elisa, I'll start with you. We sort of started to have this conversation with Derek, and he talked about the similarity and interests and what he outlined, what the Biden administration is thinking, and what the U.S. is sort of at least what we thought should be the core U.S. interests and objectives for the United States. Because the way the report goes is it all starts with that, and from that we build the military capabilities that we think the U.S. needs. So maybe you can sort of walk us through like what you think those key interests are and objectives.
Thanks, Ilan. And I just want to take a minute, even though he's already left, to thank Councillor Chollet for joining us, to thank Becca, our co-author, and Mick for joining the panel discussion today, which I think will be really, really fun and interesting as we dig into the report. I think what we tried to tackle in the report at first was this false choice of being all in or being completely withdrawn from the region. And asking that question really led us down to exactly what you just suggested, is that U.S. interests, the way we've defined them to date and have undergirded what our presence is in the Middle East, really need to be updated. And Councillor Chollet, you started to get at this a little bit, but that the way we've maintained the status quo of U.S. presence and activities is really not always linked to some of the evolving higher objectives of U.S. interests in the region. And when they are linked to objectives and interests, those interests don't hold the same relevance. right? So that there are interests that are still salient and activities that the military needs to conduct to help ensure those interests, but they're much more targeted. And we offer in the report that they require a smaller portion of the current posture to ensure them. So what are they? I think we lay out three principal interests in the report. The first being protecting the U.S. homeland from terrorism. The second being preventing the spread of nuclear weapons. And the third being preserving the freedom of navigation and free flow of commerce. Now, I think we're really clear in the report that these aren't the only interests that the United States has in the region, but that we argue they are the most important. And it kind of leads us down a path of very specific objectives to meet these interests. On protecting the homeland, the objective really is to disrupt and degrade capabilities of terror networks that threaten us and that threaten our allies. And what we conclude in the report is that this really isn't about pursuing the elimination of terrorism everywhere. It is focused on kind of an enduring effort to contain and manage those threats, but also with a recognition that the factors that contribute to the rise in risk of terrorism are very complicated. They are long-term issues, and they're not necessarily addressed by military means alone. And CNAS has done a lot of work on this particular point in the last year as well. I think with respect to the preventing the spread of nuclear weapons, here the objective focuses primarily on preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, since it's the most likely to become a nuclear state in the Middle East. And it has two parts, right? One is a credible deterrent today. And the second part is, in the event that Iran does move towards becoming a threshold nuclear state, that we retain the capability to address that contingency. But I will note here too that it is part and parcel of this objective, kind of a broader non-proliferation goal, because as a number of new nuclear states rise and non-state actors may gain access to these weapons grows, the likelihood for instability and conflict in the region only rises. And so the non-proliferation objective, broadly speaking, is also kind of embedded in this. And then with respect to that third interest on freedom of navigation and commerce, here it's really about ensuring that these global commons that are essential crossroads for international commerce are secure. And so many of those key choke points are in the region, right? The Suez Canal, the Bab el-Mandeb, the Strait of Hormuz, the broader Arabian Sea. So these peaceful waters are critical to facilitating global trade, which is a core US interest, especially as it relates to Europe and the Indo-Pacific. But I think I'll make two final points here, and that's how the interests have changed over time. In the past, I think, with respect to this question of freedom of navigation, the emphasis on free flow of commerce has always been interpreted as being synonymous with US access to energy resources from the region, and this dates back to the Carter Doctrine. But the United States is less dependent on oil now than it was in the past. And I think we have argued in other work that we've done in the past that the global oil market has proven to be relatively resilient, even as crises have happened in the region. And we saw this during the disruption to production after Iranian attacks on critical infrastructure in Saudi Arabia. So these waterways as a part of the global commons means that the United States is not alone or even primarily responsible for ensuring it, but that others have an interest in securing access not only to energy flows, but to global commerce, generally speaking. And I think the other last point that I might make is building on something that Derek said, and that is the U.S. commitment to Israel's security and being a staunch ally of Israel. I think here that critical partnership endures and will continue to be key to U.S. views on the region. But I also think it's important, and we argue in the report, to note that Israel has the most sophisticated, advanced, capable military in the region. And coupled with its economic prowess, its innovation, its technology, that partnership between the United States and Israel is much more reliant on security cooperation and much less reliant on actual US military presence and posture in the region. So the benefits that Israel may have enjoyed from a broad US military presence and footprint in the region in the past has also changed. And so our approach to that should change as well. I think I'll stop there.
Great. So now, Becca, I'm going to go to you because, like, I think Elisa outlined sort of how we thought about this strategically. You know, where does this actually translate to, especially when it comes to these big questions of sort of the military activities we should be pursuing and some of the major posture changes that we're thinking about in the region?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Ilan. And I'll start with sort of this idea about that sort of overarchingly frames our report, which is, the United States needs to incur risk in some areas. Councillor Chollet talked about, this sort of rack and stack of priorities and how the United States as a global power has all of these responsibilities, but can't necessarily be everywhere and anywhere at every single time. So thinking through sort of where it is that the United States should accept some risk. And, in our report, we posit that the Middle East is actually an area where the United States should accept some risk. So thinking through what, the next national defense strategy might have as its force planning construct, you'll definitely see at least I think you'll end up seeing a prioritization of China, sustainment against Russia, but then you're also going to see, where the United States is going to choose to accept risk in other regions that are not necessarily the Indo-Pacific, with the Middle East being one of them. So with that framing, we really wanted to do this deep dive on the military activities that we thought were necessary to preserve some of the core U.S. interests, to be able to credibly deter some of the threats, whether that's a threat from Iran or a violent non-state actor that the United States might face, and how it is that they could do that while still sort of acknowledging that there was a higher level of risk that Washington would be willing to accept in the Middle East. So Elisa broke down some of those core military objectives that were tied to the interests. And so I'll just run through some of those really quickly to talk about some of the general muscle movements, not in too much detail, because we don't have all day, and I could probably talk about this all day, and the implications for posture. So thinking through for sort of the disruption and degradation of terror networks that have the ability to threaten the United States, including the U.S. homeland, which is, top protection of that is really the top U.S. priority, as well as protecting some of our allies. And, this requires the United States to, as it's rethinking what its posture might be, what forces and capabilities it needs to retain in the Middle East, it needs to retain some of those core counterterrorism capabilities. Thinking through what that is, that means that there's going to be a need to keep some special operations forces. It's going to require keeping some strike aircraft, some UAVs and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities in order to do sort of that find, fix, finish for high-value targets if the United States needs to be able to do that. But it also requires thinking through some of our building partner capacity efforts. Traditionally, security cooperation tends to be sort of a broad swath where it's training militaries to sort of build from the ground up and across a range of different areas and activities. And we actually think that focusing a little bit more on building high-end counterterrorism partners is really what will be most effective in the region. And, we've seen this being applied in more recent cases, such as the fight against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, to a fair degree of success. So trying to think through, again, how it is that we do some of our traditional military activities in the region in a different way. And that's rethinking some of our building partner capacity and security cooperation efforts. As we are instead thinking through how it is that we could prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, I think here there's sort of two main parts of this. The first is, as Elisa mentioned, retaining a credible deterrent, right? We want to be able to hold Iran's nuclear program at risk, and also be able to act in the case of an Iran contingency. It's worth noting that heavy bombers that would potentially be used to strike Iran's nuclear capability, if it were to come to that, those don't need to be based in the Middle East. And in fact, they actually can't be supported by most of the bases in the Middle East. So thinking through, do we need to have bombers in the Middle East? Is that essential to being able to strike in the case of a contingency? And is it an effective deterrent? Trying to think through some of those key questions to get us to what less genuinely looks like. But another core element of that is force protection of U.S. forces against the missile threat. And here, this speaks to a broader posture change, which is thinking through more of a distributed basing structure and architecture. And I'll get into what that looks like in a little bit. We also have, securing key waterways in the region to ensure freedom of navigation and the free flow of commerce. And I think there's sort of three main efforts here. One is, air and sea patrols in order to keep some of those critical maritime choke points open. There's also counter-mine operations. And then there's also security cooperation with the aim to enhance burden sharing in this area. And I happen to think that, the maritime domain is one of those areas that is most ripe for burden sharing, both for potentially over the long term, some of our regional partners, but also with some of our core Asian and European allies. And so all of this really suggests, some major muscle movements when it comes to, U.S. military posture in the region. And, sort of to the report's title, it really does mean trying to do more with less. It means rethinking what our ground force presence looks like. We don't need to have, a large number of boots on the ground to support ground operations in Iraq and Syria. A lot of that has wound down and is winding down. So thinking through what that ground force presence should be, it should be smaller and it should be targeted to some of the core activities that the U.S. military actually needs to undertake, like counterterrorism, like logistics, like maintenance, not necessarily the really sexy stuff, but the deeply important stuff if the United States wants to retain the ability to surge in case of some type of contingency. It also means being smart about some of the resources that we have, and again, prioritizing those activities that support U.S. interests and truly enhance deterrence. It means thinking smarter about security cooperation efforts, but it also means things like putting an end to large conventional deployments that are really just truly shows of force, but don't actually have any deterrent value at the end of the day. And so thinking through, again, what that slim down presence does and how it would ensure the reallocation of different capabilities to other priority theaters, that means that you don't necessarily need to have this expansive network of basing. Instead, you could look to pursue the consolidation of some bases and facilities. You could look to reduce your force presence at some of the major operating bases in the region. And you can also start to try and pursue a distributed basing structure. These are bases that are outside of some of the worst threat rings. They are bases that are a little bit more austere, and they allow, a lot more sort of security and survivability of U.S. forces, which is deeply important to the United States. So again, to sort of bring it all full circle, this is where the risk comes in. The United States should have a smaller footprint, and it should be smarter about the activities that it does to pursue its interests both in the Middle East and globally. But it also needs to make sure that it has the ability to surge for some of the contingencies that might come up, whether that's with Iran or, a terrorist network. Having this requires having some of the right basing and access agreements in place. It requires being able to flow capabilities into theater. And again, thinking through what we need to retain in the region, we need to sort of look to that and sort of have that in mind. So I'm going to end with that then.
Thanks, Becca. So, and I have so many views. I could also pepper you with questions on that and come back, but I'm sure we'll get into some more of the details here. So Mick, I want to turn to you. And first I want to pick up on something that Becca was talking about, which your report really emphasizes being smarter and how we do this counterterrorism mission and building partner capacity. And we've seen some pretty harsh examples of how things go wrong lately. I mean, whether it was, the Iraqi security forces falling apart in 2011, or more recently, the Afghan security forces falling apart. which makes everybody think, well, we can't do anything and this is all hopeless, which I'm not sure is the answer either, because we still have these interests. So you've written a lot about this. You've written about, for MEI, some really interesting stuff about what sustainable model might look like that I think is very consistent with what we're recommending. And maybe you can sort of walk through folks also based on, on your experience on the ground doing this for years.
Yeah, thanks, Ilan. First, greetings to everybody from the mountains of Montana, some of which have snow on it already. And to start with, very good report. I agreed with most of it. Certainly the part about how it shouldn't be an all or nothing type approach, right? We're fully capable of being in all regions of the world, and we should be. That will adjust based on the facts on the ground, right? To your point, Ilan, I agree. We have seen dramatically different results from the way we conduct partner force operations. You referenced my partner, Derek Chollet, and I, who is a retired SEAL, wrote a couple papers for MEI on this topic. So yeah, being smarter about it, focusing on more elite units, I think is the way to go, not trying to create a mirror image of our own military and partner forces, which essentially are unsustainable without the direct input of the U.S. military, is not the way to go. And I think we saw that when we had to return to Iraq after we departed, and they could not maintain their territorial integrity with ISIS. And then we saw it almost instantaneously in Afghanistan. But if you look inside of both of those efforts, both my former organization, the CIA, and obviously the Special Operations Command of the military, had several very successful efforts with elite units in Afghanistan and Iraq that were very effective and allowed us to be able to enable them where they did most of the fighting, to some with great success, both against the Taliban in Afghanistan, against ISIS in Syria and Iraq. And I think what we call the tactical advantage approach, which is essentially building a partner force so it has the capability of defeating the common enemy. We enable it. We have the aircraft that needed to support it with close air support and all the things comes with it, intelligence and advisors. That's essentially what we can do and can make a very effective force. So as we look to shift to other areas of the world, and I would point out that competition against Russia and China should be based more on activities, vice a geographic location on a map. But as we look to shift resources to support our diplomatic efforts in other areas like the Indo-Pacific arena, we need to build these capabilities to allow us, one, and I agree with your priority of objectives here, for the CT efforts to continue in the Middle East, because although CT is obviously further down the list in global power competition and rogue states, as soon as there is a significant attack, we all know it's going to go up to the top of the list. So we don't want that to happen. So we have to maintain our CT efforts there. But those same units, I would propose, could also be used for the other priorities, right? Not necessarily preventing countries from getting nuclear weapons, but certainly their malign activities in the region. These elite units can also be used against rogue states like what I'm calling rogue states like Iran. And of course, the freedom of navigation, right? So Iran uses their maritime special operations to target ships off the coast of Fujairah, for example. We can help build forces that can counter those and perhaps defend against this threat. So yes, I totally agree with the idea that we should focus more on elite units, but I would also add that those units can do more than just CT. They can be effective in all the free areas that you all correctly identified as our interest in the Middle East.
So, Elisa, I'm going to go back to you and ask you sort of to dive a little deeper. Mick started to get into it on this issue of Iran, right? And you and I do a lot of work on Iran, and we've done a lot of work on Iran in the past. And in many cases, the challenge posed by Iran has been like the major driver, I think, to a great extent of U.S. military posture in the region and those possible contingencies. So how do we deal with Iran in a context of drawing down some of these forces? And where do you think we are right now with Iran, given like we just had an announcement of potentially talks restarting later this month, but probably, not where all of us necessarily, or at least you and I, who put out a report about a year ago talking about a quick reentry into the JCPOA, envision things being at this point, unfortunately.
Right. That seems like a million years ago in some ways. So let me take that part of the question first. Yes, an announcement today that the Iranians expect to return to negotiations on the 29th of this month. We'll see. Having watched not only the stall in negotiations around the Iranian presidential election back in June, but also even just the Iranian reaction to the G20 statement just a few days ago, suggests to me that even if talks resume on the 29th, the path forward is really going to be a challenge. Yes, I mean, I think the way that the new government in Iran has played this so far suggests that they're willing to hold out, that they have been clear that the benefits of the JCPOA in its first iteration were underwhelming from their perspective. And they seem less interested in relinquishing the nuclear leverage that they've built over the last year or so in their increasing enrichment levels, their work on things like uranium metal, and their limited cooperation with the IAEA. So it would be a great start, I think, to get back to the negotiating table, and the sooner the better, as I think the P5+1 in all kinds of different ways has been messaging over the last few months. But I also think that our expectations, as you said, probably are going to be modest for how this plays out in the very near term. So what does that mean as we talk about adjusting our presence in the region and pushing back on Iran and preparing for potential contingencies? I think there are a couple of elements to this, and Becca outlined kind of the holding the nuclear program at risk with a credible deterrent, and then the capabilities necessary to prepare. I think there's one point that I would highlight here, and the role of our robust intelligence capabilities being essential to both of these. Right? The reality is that the worst case that we can envision, that Iran develops a secret facility that goes completely undetected until the very last moment, until it actually attains a nuclear weapon. It is the worst case, but it's also probably a lower probability than other scenarios that we've talked about in any number of papers and lots of our colleagues have talked about. And so here, the U.S. and its allies have an advantage. Right? There will likely be kind of detection of efforts for Iran to move toward that kind of clandestine route, and we'd retain some early warning capability, or we should put a premium on retaining that early warning capability in whatever posture adjustments we make in the region, because this actually is what gives us flexibility in terms of the kinds of assets that are going to be necessary to fulfill any kind of contingency. And Becca talked a little bit about this with respect to, do you need bombers in the region? Can you even support bombers in the region? And I think the early warning capability here gives us the flexibility to really think through those questions strategically, and from a perspective of taking on necessary risk, but also maximizing our capabilities where they're needed most. And what can remain inside the region, what a smaller mix of strike aircraft retention might look like, I think is where that question really needs to go. And I would just point out, at least from my point of view, what happened this last week is kind of an interesting variation on this idea, right? That a single strategic bomber went out on what CENTCOM called a presence patrol over the Red Sea. What I thought was quite striking about this was the very public display of Israeli, Saudi, Egyptian, and I think Bahraini, if I'm not mistaken, aircraft, fighter jets that escorted that patrol over their respective airspaces. And so this kind of combination of signals of deterrence and power projection, this work with partners on those areas that are most meaningful without keeping kind of the full fleet of a strike package sitting somewhere on a base in the Middle East, I think it is exactly the right direction that we're supposed to be going into. Becca also talked about rethinking basing, like dispersal and smaller footprints to help really fulfill kind of our force protection requirements and limit the amounts of targets that are available to Iranian proxies. The only other point I'd add here is what's going to be equally important is U.S. support for ballistic missile defense capabilities for our partners. And that will be an essential kind of element of how we think about what the U.S. does versus what others do, and how the U.S. can play a role in supporting that kind of capability, which is much more essential. And then finally, I think Mick made a lot of good points that I would have made about the use of elite units that are used in the counterterrorism fight that also work with respect to countering Iran's proxy activity. I think what I'd add here is that there's also a combination of military and non-military tools that becomes important in this case. And I'll use another example from just the last week. I love it when real examples present themselves in recent memory. And this is how over the last months and arguably years, the targeting of training facilities, weapon caches, other aspects of the Iranian Quds Force's support to its proxies has been a pretty steady pace, right? We've seen that in the Trump administration. We have seen it already in the first year of the Biden administration. But what we've seen just as recently as last week in response to the UAV attack on Al-Tanf is combining those kinds of targeted surgical activities with other tools like sanctions on the UAV supply chain and those that are responsible inside the Iranian system for the UAV program. And the combination of these tools used in a surgical way, right, the targeting of those capabilities as they are developing on the ground, as well as choking off kind of the procurement elements of something as ubiquitous as UAVs, right? They're cheap and they're easy to produce, is going to be equally important as we continue to kind of see that as an asymmetric tool that the Iranians are not going to relinquish anytime soon. I'll stop there.
Yeah, and I'll add one or two things here, Lisa, because this is one of my favorite topics, which is only to say, yeah, totally agree, especially on that point that bomber was based out of Diego Garcia, but still had the impact on the Middle East, but could be deployed elsewhere, right? I mean, it's a good example. And we talk on the report a lot about not everything has to be in the Middle East to impact the Middle East. And then the only other thing is, like, I often think about, when you think about these, your point on time is, I think, such an important one, right? Like, I often think that, when we think about how we're going to plan for a potential conflict with Iran, we almost put everything there that we might need, like, no matter what. So the thinking goes, well, like, what really matters is the nuclear program. So we have to have the crowd capability to do that. But they might respond with all these other things. So we have to have all these other things there too to respond to that. Where it's like, no, not if we're controlling when this starts, not if we kind of have the capability. And frankly, a lot of those other things, like you all talk about, and you and Becca both mentioned basing. The more you put in, the more targets you also create for them. So it's a really challenging balance there on that point. But Becca, I'm going to flip over to you. And something else, another element, which we didn't get into as much in the report, because it's a little bit outside the scope, but it's also something that came up really late in our work, was, this idea of Afghanistan, right? And specifically this idea of, well, we're not in Afghanistan anymore, but we're going to have an over-the-horizon force. And how you think that impacts U.S. military posture in the region.
Sure. Well, I think there is a potential risk that, Afghanistan and the idea of having this over-the-horizon force could be used as sort of the rationale to further reinforce the existing presence in the Middle East and sort of balloon some of the bases that exist. And at the end of the day, that's not actually needed. We don't need to grow our presence in the Middle East in order to fulfill the existing, responsibilities and still try and do some of these over-the-horizon activities. In fact, you can actually do a lot of that with a more slimmed-down presence. I think it's important to sort of think through why it is that the U.S. decided to end its engagement in Afghanistan after so long. Part of the idea and the sort of thinking behind it is that, by winding things down in Afghanistan, there was going to be an opportunity to recoup resources for longer term military modernization, as well as to recoup readiness so that U.S. military forces could be better prepared now and into the future to face some of the challenges that might come their way. And so we don't want to take those resource gains that were supposed to be earmarked towards modernization and readiness and sort of undermine them. We want to still try and keep those gains. So again, we shouldn't sort of be thinking about how it is we can grow our presence in the Middle East in order to do some of these over-the-horizon activities. But let's be clear about what the over-the-horizon activities are. For the most part, these are going to be air patrols, and these are going to be, doing things like ISR and being able to do strikes on whether it is a high value target to weapon storage. Those are the sorts of things that we are going to need to retain capabilities for. And so that says that we're going to need to retain some strike aircraft, not a lot, but some. UAVs, in particular, you could think that MQ-9s would be exceptionally useful in this case, both because of what they can bring in terms of surveillance, but also some of their longer duration time on station, and the fact that they can be equipped with different munitions for strikes. But it also speaks to retaining a robust aerial refueling capability, because no matter what, no matter where you are in the Middle East you're taking off from, there's going to be a long transit time, and then you need to be able to just sort of keep all of your assets up in the air to do some of the intelligence and surveillance that they'll need to do prior to a strike, particularly as the U.S. government should be taking all necessary steps to look at various targets to reduce the chance of civilian casualties, as we've already seen in Afghanistan. So thinking through all of that, that's what we would need to retain at some of the existing air bases in the Middle East. What we don't need to do is we don't need to grow those bases, and we also don't need to think about putting a carrier in the broader CENTCOM area of responsibility, because even a carrier can't bring that much to doing over the horizon strikes. They've got aircraft that have a bit that are a bit more short range. Again, there's sort of an extensive aerial refueling requirement for that, and there's not a ton of value add to having a carrier close by. It can't get that close in. So again, Afghanistan shouldn't be the rationale for trying to, sort of build up U.S. presence in the CENTCOM AOR, whether that is a carrier or whether that is an expansion of the bases that are already existing in the Middle East. But sort of thinking through how it is that we could do all of these over-the-horizon activities in a smart way that don't end up undermining some of the gains that we have gotten from reducing our activities in Afghanistan.
Yeah, and I should say on the carrier, this is definitely a point we get into in the report, both when it comes to Afghanistan, but also on issues like Iran and freedom of navigation. When you have Iranian proxy groups attacking Americans in Iraq with relatively low sophistication, whether it's UAVs or rockets, it's a mismatch of resources to respond to that with a carrier strike group into the region. We're losing when we do that. That's a very expensive response to try to deter that. And it's not even clear it does deter that, right? I mean, it sends a message. It's it's an incredibly, impressive suite of capabilities that come with that carrier and a carrier strike group, but it's not the best use of our resources necessarily. And for so long, and it's also what's necessarily needed to, keep open some of these key waterways. So there's other ways of doing that. It's another one of the themes of the report that I just want to stress because we haven't gotten to it as much so far. But there certainly also applies to Afghanistan. So Mick, I'm going to turn back to you, and I'm also going to start bringing in some audience questions as I do this. So, a couple of questions for you, one from me and one from our audience that I think are quite related. We've heard from Councillor Chollet who worked in, was working in the Biden administration, worked in the Obama administration on these challenges. But, during the Trump administration, the national defense strategy really was about great power competition. It was about shifting focus to Russia and to a greater extent, China. And you were working in the Middle East office at that time, trying to balance that, even as we had challenges there. So I'm kind of curious about, your experiences and how you saw it from that seat and the challenges of trying to make that shift while still having all these, inevitable emergencies and things that start popping. And also as part of it, Ryan Johnson, one of our participants, asked, what would you say are the most sort of challenging bureaucratic adaptations that we would have to make, especially at DoD and state, as we kind of see this shift, to great power competition, after the last 20 years where the Middle East has been the central point of organizing. So maybe you can get into some of both of those things.
Sure, and I don't see it much different now that I'm, not in that seat. But I would say that you're correct. I mean, Secretary Mattis was very clear that the near-peer competitors were our primary concern, right? But he, as well as all of his staff, and myself included, realized that you just don't get to end wars like the war on terrorism, for example, because you're tired of it. So what I would say is we can do many things at once, right? So I think once we started really projecting the national defense strategy, many people saw it as let's all shift to that. Even units that were specifically tailored and had been honed to be very good at fighting terrorists, for example, kind of looked at where they could participate in the competition, if you will. And a lot of them found out that there really wasn't a role. And so what I would say is we need to identify the units that do have more of a role in countering China or Russia, and the units that really are tailor-made to continue this fight against the terrorist threat, and do both. And I would argue the over the horizon, although I do agree with your points on the Middle East, when it comes to a conventional fight or preparing for a conventional fight, it wouldn't be a good thing to have all your resources in the region. It just makes them more vulnerable. The bombers is a great example. Why would you want them there when they don't need to be there? But when it comes to the counterterrorism fight, although we can and have been successful in this over the horizon concept, although intelligence is important in all areas of warfare, it is particularly important in counterterrorism. And it is, you can bring air assets in, you can bring in, direct action assets if you need to, but you have to have the intelligence collection capability on the ground for either of those two to be effective. So the over the horizon, when it comes to counterterrorism, I think still relies on some capacity to develop the intelligence pictures, to be able to execute the operation. So it's going to be incredibly difficult in Afghanistan now that we don't have that. But we still have presence in places like Yemen and Somalia, and to a certain extent Libya, and other places in, of course, Iraq and Syria. That, even if it's a minor presence, it's not about numbers, it's about the skill sets of the people that are there, gives us the ability to keep other assets, other air assets, perhaps outside of the immediate arena. But we have to have that capability, or it really doesn't do us any good, because we don't know what the threat is, where it is, and when it's going to be there. So I think that's an important point. I'd also say that there was an irregular warfare annex to the national defense strategy that called on several things that I think were spot on and hopefully continue. One, conventional forces can also contribute to the irregular warfare. Like, we've kind of got this idea now you have to be with special operations. It's never been the case throughout history. Conventional infantry units can help train conventional infantry units, right, in FID, for example, foreign internal defense. Also, special operations can do more than just CT. I know we already talked about that, but we need to find a productive way that they fit into the near-peer competitors or strategic competitors in countries like North Korea and Iran. And maybe it won't be, probably won't be the kinetic side of special operations, but the influence side, the kind of psyops, I think we brought that term back, those kind of things that's traditionally in special operations can be very effective if used the right way and guided by a larger entity that can actually coordinate all of our messages into the different areas of competition. So I'd also throw that in.
Yeah, and just to build on that, with a couple of the first of all, just really interesting, Mick, because I've always seen it from the, sort of, this is the challenge at the senior leader level. When everybody says we're shifting, we shift, right? And the policy shifts, and then you forget about this stuff that blows up in your face, right? And then it just suddenly brings everybody back in because you've overshifted, and then you've actually, right. And it's interesting to hear you describe it also for units, and units having the same thing, like throughout the whole system, like the bureaucracy always moves to like, okay, this is how we are most relevant, and this is how we are like most important. We're like, no, guys, like you need to sometimes keep doing the things you're good at so that we can move other pieces off. But that's hard for everybody to accept, because then you're no longer at the center of the action. It's like an inevitable bureaucratic reaction. But it's how we have to do these things. I mean, that is really like, it's at the core of like this entire report and the case we've been trying to make, right? Like we can't keep, if we just run away again, we're just going to screw up like everything in the Middle East and we'll be back. We really do need to like think carefully about what needs to be there. And then only one other point, just that was very much in our report, when it comes to intelligence collection, agree completely. Human and some of these other things, are people on the ground is critical. In terms of air, we also sometimes misuse some of the assets that we have. I know that, one of the things we talk about is like SOCOM's been asking for a cheaper plane that can specifically be designed for, CT missions, as opposed to having to use high-end, strike aircraft for things that we don't necessarily need them to be doing in the Middle East. And they'd be much better off, in the Indo-Pacific, and you can do those at much less. So those are just a couple of the ideas that I'd throw into the mix additionally. Elisa, another one of our audience members asked, like, what do you think about Europe and NATO's role and responsibility if we're kind of shifting to the Middle East, or shifting less, having, I guess the word is U.S. realigns military presence in the Middle East, which is a good way to describe it. And, I think you and me and Becca are going to be spending a lot of time thinking about that over the next few days, some of the things we're doing after this. So I'd love to get your take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of things I would say about that question. One is, there's a record here of work that we have done with our European allies with respect to some of the challenges in the region. They're not the most glamorous pieces of our operations, and so you don't really think about them or hear about them quite as much. But here I'm thinking about maritime task force that have worked on anti-piracy around the Horn of Africa, for example, where our European partners have played a significant role over a long period of time, and is an indicator of how that kind of naval cooperation can work. Another more recent example of how that kind of naval cooperation can work is what we saw with respect to how our European partners came right into the fray with us when we saw increased targeting of commercial and military naval vessels much closer to home, in and around the Strait of Hormuz and around the Gulf of Yemen, of Aden, and into the Red Sea, where I think is probably where some attention can always be paid. And this is not to suggest it's not happening, but how we systematize this, how we really deepen this coordination, how we look at kind of complementary asset mixes, and how it can align with some of the core interests that we've outlined for the U.S., but that our European allies share. I think the last point I would make is, as we think about and talk about our own interest in engaging in the kinds of security cooperation and training activities that focus on specific kinds of capabilities, elite and otherwise, our European partners do the same. NATO obviously has had training missions in Iraq for the last 15 years. How do we talk to our European partners about an alignment in those kind of operational level activities where we're really focusing on developing and building on each other's work with respect to capabilities of partners in the region? I think is an area where more conversation can happen and should build on good work that's already been done.
Yeah, and I'll only add on that, as I'm now peppering some of my own views in, is the liberty of the moderator is that, in some cases, our European partners are physically closer to the Middle East than we are, and their interests are more engaged than ours. Doesn't mean we should leave, doesn't mean we're going to be able to replace the U.S., but there is an argument to be made that they could do a little more there and allowing us to do a little bit less, as opposed to an instinct, again, part of the whole chasing thing we were talking about. You can see the Europeans trying to chase the U.S. into the Indo-Pacific, since that seems to be our big new target now. But maybe a more effective use of NATO is, partnerships that allow Europe to do more in the Middle East, with where its interests are most engaged because of refugee challenges, because of terrorism that's even more directly threatening them, so that we can do more in the Indo-Pacific. Doesn't mean we leave the Middle East, doesn't mean they don't do anything in the Indo-Pacific, but it's another way of thinking about this. Becca, I want to go to you on a couple of related questions on the Gulf. And one is sort of just where we are on arms sales to the Gulf with the Biden administration. And related is kind of this question about, well, look, like if the point of the U.S. is to leave and we need to rely more on partners to do more, if we're drawing down some, how does that jive with human rights and concerns about arms sales?
Ooh, that question pulls on a lot of different threads. So let me see if I can break it down in a way that makes sense to everyone as I noodle it around in my own head. So first and foremost, we are seeing a push by the Biden administration to sort of curb arms sales in some ways to make them more consistent with some of the human rights objectives that the administration is trying to promote. Again, ensuring that, not only are arms sales, properly going through some of the Leahy vetting processes and whatnot that we would usually see, but that, some of the arms sales could be conditioned on human rights and seeing improvements in human rights. And one of the regions where we do see this sort of new push really trying to focus on is the Middle East, as there have traditionally been some examples of U.S. military equipment being used in ways that Washington doesn't find to be in line with its values. So you have this, you also have a number of the Middle East countries in the Middle East, particularly in the Gulf, really being some of the top consumers of U.S. arms, in part because they are, oil-rich petrostates and have some of the ability to purchase some of these capabilities. And this all happens against the backdrop of strategic competition with China and with Russia. And one of the areas that we've sort of seen this competition play out is in the periphery of the Middle East, where it's sort of, all three countries are interested in and have, fairly decent presence and trying to be more involved. And a lot of that strategic competition has been almost a competition for influence, if you will. And arms sales have factored into that competition for influence. So there's been this steady drumbeat that you tend to hear in some quarters of the US government, particularly at the combatant command level, of, if we do not sell all of our Gulf partners the arms that they've been asking for, including some incredibly high-end equipment that I would argue they don't necessarily have the capacity to absorb, nor do they really have a good rationale for why they would use it, which makes it at sometimes a little suspect as we're thinking about human rights. If we don't sell them this equipment, they're just going to go to China or to Russia. And, while this is, important to think about as we're trying to think through how it is that the U.S. still manages to support its allies and partners around the globe, and how it is that the United States can outposition its biggest strategic competitors, I happen to think that sometimes falling into that argument ends up putting the United States in sort of that bigger, never-ending cycle. Because if we are going to be selling partners capabilities that they don't actually need, it ends up being counterintuitive to their own military development. So I happen to believe that, there are very important instances where the United States should sort of hold back on selling some arms and thinking through, hey, what do you need this for? Why is it that you actually want it, aside from it being a prestige item? And if there's a real rational case for it, making sure that it's sort of fitting into building partner capacity in a way that makes sense. Ultimately, we want our Gulf partners and our Middle Eastern partners more broadly to be able to take responsibility for their own neighborhood. Again, the idea is that would reduce some reliance on the United States. But I think we're a long ways off from that. So rethinking how it is that we are building partner capacity in some of these niche areas that actually support the most important missions that we need our partners to be able to do to protect themselves, to protect their neighbors, and to help support some of the broader regional stability that we want. We need to sort of double down on focusing on that. And sometimes that means rethinking whether we need to fulfill every single arms request, and whether doing so is actually smart, because part of this is about military development, but also part of it is ensuring that some of those capabilities are used in the right way. One of the issues that we sometimes find is that what the United States views as counterterrorism sometimes can be viewed by Middle Eastern partners as an internal defense force, in which some of those capabilities could actually be used against their own citizens in ways that we find to be violations of human rights. So thinking through, again, some of those niche capabilities and the niche areas that we want them to develop actual capacity, and thinking through how it is that we can do that in a way that actually protects some of the human rights priorities that we've been trying to promote around the globe is definitely something that the Biden administration is trying to work on, and I think is a much longer term effort. But we can do that while at the same time not having to freak out that Russia and China are going to come in and sell capabilities, because at the end of the day, that's kind of classic hedging behavior, and that's something that we should expect as we're trying to make some of these more heavy muscle movements of realigning what the U.S. posture and presence is in the Middle East.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just point out that we've spent a lot of this report talking about all the big fancy weapons the U.S. doesn't need in the Middle East, because really nobody needs them in the Middle East necessarily, right? I mean, that's kind of the argument. So I want to close really with an opportunity for all three of you. Mick, I want to give you an opportunity to both respond to what's been said, especially like Becca's answer to that most recent question, because that's something that I know you have worked on a lot in your job. And then also really to all three of you in this final round, a lot of what we've talked about at CNAS over the last year, we've had this project on demilitarizing U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, of which this is the last part, right? But it's also about a lot more long-term sustainable diplomatic approach, which Derek talked about, and also an economic and governance, which ultimately are maybe the biggest problem the region faces. So any ideas you have that we should be throwing on the table, we think about these other elements as we de-emphasize some of the military elements would also be valuable. So Mick, over to you.
Yeah, so first I'd agree totally with what Becca just said. I think we need to look at all factors when it comes to weapon sales, which is competition, yes, but also human rights. And the last one I'd just say is capacity, right? So what are we actually doing? Are we building capacity that allows us to shift to other places, or is this more of a ego? You have to have the newest weapon system, even if you don't know how to maintain it or operate it. So I think we have to view it with all three factors, and it should be at the end of the day, and our interest is why we're doing it, and that could be to promote a human rights point of view, and that could also be to help our military, right? So they don't have to basically do everything for the partners, and the partners can do some for themselves. So that's the first part. The other part, and you just hit it, and Secretary Mattis to say, if we have fewer diplomats, I'm going to need more bullets. And he certainly wasn't advocating for more bullets. What he was saying is the military, and I agree with this wholeheartedly, should be in support of our diplomatic efforts. The diplomatic efforts of the United States should lead our international engagements everywhere. The military can shift, and we have that capacity. We have the most expeditionary military in the world, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff can shift resources as needed. But that should be in support of our diplomatic efforts and objectives. And I think that's where we're getting to now, and that's the right place to be.
Elisa.
I can be really quick because I have a couple of really strong thoughts, views on this question. It gives me a chance to say first, the imperative of having U.S. ambassadors at our embassies so that they can represent at the highest level U.S. interests and values overseas. It sounds a little bit like I'm making a plug here. I am. I think when we talk about the bureaucracy a bit, here, how we recruit and retain a diverse and robust and innovative State Department and USAID workforce, first and foremost, comes into play. This is a long game, right? This is not something that we can do necessarily tomorrow, but it's what ensures that as we shift from 20 years of war, we are building the tools to take the place of that in some respects, and you can't do that without a capable workforce in our diplomacy and our development agencies. And then this is a little bit less comfortable for folks, but I really do think that we need to think about how that same workforce takes on a bit more risk to do what Councillor Chollet mentioned early on, which is to engage more and to engage in more places around the world, and that too, as a derivative of the last 20 years, is a difficult conversation, but I think one that's really important. These aren't the glamorous things about give State Department and USAID more money, although we should, but these are the fundamentals I think that we need to ensure are in place in order to deliver on what Mick rightly points out. Is the imperative of having diplomacy lead with the credible military to support it.
Becca, I'm going to give you the last word. Except for me.
Oh my goodness. I don't know if you want to do that. I'll be short because I know we're really short on time. And I'll just say, as much as this report is about right-sizing U.S. military presence in the Middle East, it's actually more broadly about how it is that we right-size the U.S. military to be in support of other levers of power, including economic and informational and diplomacy. And so I'll just leave with that very pithy statement that I think sounds okay.
Yeah, and I'll just say, and I say this all the time, like in other parts of the world where U.S. policy has, I would argue, maybe been more successful than it has been in the Middle East, whether that's in Europe or in the Indo-Pacific. We have led first with our economic model. We have led with our governance model. And the U.S. military has been there in support of those things, providing the necessary security. But that's not where we started with. And in the Middle East, too often we just go to aircraft carriers and airplanes and then think about those other things, which we don't do in other places in the world. And we really need to reshape that. And that's been the whole point of this effort in the last year at CNAS and a lot of the work that we've done. So I want to thank our panelists and co-authors. I want for joining us for this, and Derek Chollet, Councillor Chollet at the State Department. Thank you to our audience for joining us for the last hour and a half. And just a reminder, the report is When Less is More, Rethinking U.S. Military Strategy and Posture in the Middle East, and you can find it on CNAS's website. Thank you, everybody.